The late afternoon sun poured molten gold over the dustwood auction grounds, casting long, jittery shadows across the packed dirt arena. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, stirred by restless boots and the occasional flick of a horse's tail. Among the sea of weathered faces hidden beneath sun-bleached cowboy hats, one figure stood out: Calla Wren, a veteran whose military uniform seemed almost foreign in the sea of denim and leather. Her boots pressed firm into the earth, carrying the weight of invisible battles most here would never understand. As she stepped closer to the pen, the murmurs began, low at first, then sharper, more poisonous. "A soldier playing rancher?" someone scoffed, voice dripping with disdain. Merle Stowe, a seasoned breeder with a twisted smile, leaned toward his buddy, Thatcher Vex, and muttered loud enough for others to hear, "She thinks money can teach her what blood and generations earned." Laughter rippled through the wooden bleachers, hot and mean. Calla's hand tightened around the envelope tucked inside her jacket, hard-earned savings meant for one thing only: the horse waiting just beyond the gate. In the center of the ring stood Ashfall, a magnificent sorrel quarter horse, muscles rippling under his copper-red coat, eyes burning with barely contained fire. He was a legend in these parts, proud, unbroken, and widely regarded as untouchable. Calla's gaze locked with Ashfall's, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, raw and unnerving. She advanced a step, only to be stopped by Ransom Duval, the auctioneer, who called out with a slow, mocking drawl, "Hope you brought more than just bravery, ma'am." Ashfall don't care for pity. The crowd roared with cruel laughter, the sound crashing over her like a wave. Calla stood motionless, her face carved from stone, but inside, a storm raged. Every mocking word chipped away at her battered heart, memories of comrades lost, promises made, and the gnawing ache of never truly belonging anywhere. The desert, the noise, the unbearable silence of returning home, it all crowded in at once. Yet here, in this arena, she would not yield. Then it happened. Ashfall, who had been barely restrained by the handler, snapped his head, ripped the lead from the man's hands, and charged forward, not in wild rebellion, but with startling precision. The massive horse stopped inches from Calla, breathing hard, his nostrils flaring. The arena held its breath. Ashfall dipped his head slightly, as if bowing only to her. Whispers rose around the ring, disbelief spreading like wildfire. For the first time all day, Calla allowed herself a small, grim smile. She hadn't come to beg. She had come to be chosen, and Ashfall had just made the first move. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Dust spiraled lazily in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the rafters, and all eyes were frozen on Calla and Ashfall. Murmurs flickered like embers among the crowd, but no one dared speak loud enough to break the fragile, electric moment. Calla could feel Ashfall's hot breath on her hand, the wild rhythm of his heart almost matching her own. She reached out with steady fingers, grazing his muzzle, and Ashfall, the untamable beast of dustwood, stood unmoving, as if the touch tethered him to earth itself. Ransom Duval cleared his throat, dragging the crowd back into the crueler reality. "Well, ain't that something?" he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "But this ain't a fairy tale, folks. It's still a horse auction. Bids start at 20 grand. His voice cracked through the arena like a whip. Heads turned, whispers sharpened into scoffs. $20,000, a mountain for most around here, but especially for an outsider like Calla. She swallowed hard. She had brought just enough, scraped together from odd jobs and sleepless nights. She had counted every dollar twice. The first bid came from Thatcher Vex, his voice loud and smug. 25, he shouted, smirking directly at Calla. Another quickly followed, Merle Stowe, raising to 30. They weren't bidding because they wanted Ashfall. They were bidding because they didn't want her to have him. Calla's chest tightened. This wasn't a simple auction. It was a battle, a trial by fire. Her fingers brushed the envelope hidden beneath her jacket, feeling the thin edge of hope inside. She would have to choose her moment carefully. One wrong move, and all her sacrifices would mean nothing. The numbers rose brutally, each one another slap in her face. 40,000. 45. At 50, Calla could see the mocking smiles in the stands. They knew. She was almost out. The taste of defeat, bitter and familiar, crept onto her tongue. Ransom's gavel hovered in the air, eager to fall. Calla's mind raced. Strategies, risks, memories of commanders barking orders in the chaos of war. She couldn't outbid them with dollars. She needed something they didn't understand. Will. In a bold, clear voice, Calla stepped forward, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "I bid 55, she said, louder than she thought possible. Gasps rippled through the arena. Thatcher and Merle exchanged confused glances. They hadn't expected her to keep fighting. Ransom hesitated, eyes narrowing. In that moment, Ashfall tossed his head and neighed sharply, the sound echoing like a war cry through the silent arena. It was as if the horse himself had endorsed her defiance. Calla's heart hammered in her chest. She had thrown her last card on the table. Ransom leaned over the podium, a crooked smile twitching at his lips. 55 to the lady in uniform, he drawled. Any takers? The seconds stretched unbearably. The men who had mocked her sat in stunned silence. No more bids came. The gavel rose, then fell with a final, resounding crack. Sold. Calla had done the impossible, but as Ashfall nickered softly beside her, she sensed the real battle was only just beginning. Calla's boots sank slightly into the soft dirt as she led Ashfall out of the arena, the murmurs of the crowd still buzzing behind her like angry hornets. The heavy envelope, now nearly emptied of every hard-earned dollar she owned, weighed like lead against her chest. Ashfall's lead rope was loose in her hands, but the massive sorrel quarter horse stayed close, moving in rhythm with her steps. She could feel the stares boring into her back, some filled with disdain, others with a grudging, silent awe. None of it mattered now. What mattered was that Ashfall had chosen her. But had she truly earned him yet? In the quiet shade behind the auction barn, Calla finally allowed herself to exhale. The adrenaline that had carried her through the bidding now drained away, leaving her legs trembling. She turned to Ashfall, who watched her with large, intelligent eyes, his nostrils still flaring from the tension. Slowly, she removed her cap, running a hand through her short-cropped hair, exposing the military scars she usually kept hidden. She wasn't sure what Ashfall saw when he looked at her, a broken soldier, a desperate woman, or simply someone too stubborn to quit, but whatever it was, it had called to him. A sharp voice broke her reverie. "That horse is gonna kill you, soldier girl," sneered Lane Cormac, a wiry stable hand leaning against the barn door with arms crossed. His voice was tinged with something Calla couldn't immediately place, fear or resentment, maybe both. "He don't bond with nobody. You're foolin' yourself thinkin' he'll be any different for you." His words weren't a warning, they were a curse spat out into the dust. Calla met his eyes, steady and unflinching, and said nothing. She simply tightened her grip on Ashfall's lead and turned away. As she walked toward the old livestock trailer she had borrowed for the day, doubts began gnawing at her like unseen wolves. She had survived firefights, landmines, and the slow death of hope overseas. Yet here, faced with a single animal, she felt terrifyingly vulnerable. What if Lane was right? What if Ashfall's moment of connection in the arena had been just a fluke, a trick of adrenaline and coincidence? The trailer loomed ahead, rusted and rattling in the wind, and Calla's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Ashfall balked at the trailer's open gate, snorting and tossing his head violently. Calla stepped aside, giving him space, speaking softly into the cooling dusk. "Easy, boy, easy." Her voice cracked with more emotion than she meant to show. She didn't yank or pull, she simply waited. Long moments passed. Ashfall's ears flicked back and forth, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he placed one hoof onto the trailer ramp. Then another. Calla held her breath as he stepped fully inside. No force, no fear, only trust, as fragile and powerful as glass. Behind her, Lane Cormac spat into the dirt and muttered under his breath, "Won't last a week." But Calla didn't hear him. She closed the trailer door gently, sealing away not just a horse, but a beginning she hadn't dared to dream was possible, and a battle for belonging that was only just beginning to unfold. The drive home was a blur of empty roads and a setting sun bleeding red across the horizon. Calla's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, every bump in the worn-out road sending tremors through the rattling trailer behind her. Ashfall's occasional shifting caused the whole rig to sway, but she didn't flinch. The real instability wasn't on the highway, it was inside her chest, a silent battle between triumph and fear. She had won the auction, yes, but could she win Ashfall's trust where so many had failed? By the time she reached the old farmhouse she rented on the outskirts of Dustwood, night had swallowed the landscape. Calla backed the trailer expertly into the paddock, the truck's headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the dry pasture. Crickets sang in the darkness, and somewhere far off, a lone coyote howled. As she climbed down, a cold wind caught the edge of her jacket, sending a shiver through her spine. Everything about tonight felt heavy, expectant, like the calm before a coming storm. Carefully, she opened the trailer gate. Ashfall stood inside, wide-eyed but unmoving. Calla spoke to him in low, steady tones, each word another fragile bridge stretched across the void between them. He stepped down, muscles tense, ears flicking at every new sound in the unfamiliar darkness. Calla led him to a small, fenced paddock adjacent to the barn, old but secure. She unclipped his lead, stepping back without trying to control him. Ashfall pawed the ground, testing the earth beneath his hooves, before trotting a tight, restless circle under the moonlight. Inside the house, Calla leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Ashfall through the window. The lamp above her buzzed and flickered, casting a pale halo around her tired frame. She poured herself a cup of stale coffee, hands still shaking slightly. Every instinct she had learned overseas screamed at her. Plan ahead, control the unknown, prepare for betrayal. But Ashfall wasn't a battlefield. He wasn't a mission. He was something different, something terrifying because it demanded she feel, not fight. As she stared out into the darkness, a memory she had long buried clawed its way free. The night her convoy was ambushed, the deafening roar of explosives, the chaos, the faces she never got to see again. Calla squeezed her eyes shut, but the ghostly echoes remained. Somehow, standing in that empty kitchen, she realized that trusting Ashfall wasn't about taming him. It was about facing the part of herself she had kept locked away. The wounded, scared part still bleeding beneath her armor. Outside, Ashfall lifted his head toward the house, his silhouette framed against the rising moon. He stood there, motionless, as if waiting, as if sensing the invisible war raging inside the woman who had dared to believe they could heal each other. Calla set down her coffee, wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, and whispered into the silent room, "One day at a time, boy. One day at a time." Morning broke with a brittle chill, a thin layer of frost dusting the dead grass around the paddock. Calla wrapped herself tighter in her worn jacket, the fabric stiff against her skin, and stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in her hand. Ashfall was already awake, pacing the fence line like a restless spirit. His copper-red coat shimmered under the weak sunlight, but his movements were sharp, defensive, a warning that the fragile thread between them could snap at any moment. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, giving Ashfall time to read her intentions. He stopped, watching her with the same fierce eyes that had stared down hundreds of bidders the day before. Calla set the coffee down on a fence post, pulling a worn halter from her belt. Her heart pounded in her ears. She knew trust wasn't given. It had to be built, one breath, one step, one mistake at a time. Still, the soldier inside her hated the vulnerability, the feeling of waiting for a misstep that could cost everything. Ashfall allowed the halter to slip over his head without resistance, but the tension crackled in the air like a live wire. Calla led him into a small round pen she'd hastily repaired the night before, the boards creaking under even her lightest touch. She needed to know if yesterday's miracle was a fleeting spark or the beginning of something real. As she released him into the ring, Ashfall exploded into motion, kicking up thick clouds of dust, muscles rippling under his sorrel coat. He circled her, a living storm, every hoofbeat pounding a challenge into the earth. Calla stood her ground, body loose, breathing slow. No commands. No shouting. Only presence, a steady heartbeat amid the chaos. Ashfall's ears flicked toward her, then away, uncertainty etched in every stride. The warhorse in her wanted to issue orders, to seize control. But the woman, the broken part still learning how to heal, knew she had to earn this the hard way. The dust choked the air, clinging to her face, her clothes, sinking into her very bones. But she didn't waver. She stayed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ashfall slowed. His massive frame heaved with effort, sweat darkening his sides. He turned his body slightly inward, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but enough. A sign of acknowledgement. Calla's throat tightened. She knew better than to celebrate too soon, but inside, something flickered, a fragile ember of hope, daring to burn a little brighter. As she reached out a tentative hand, Ashfall stepped closer, nostrils flaring. His breath hit her skin, warm and alive. In that suspended moment, surrounded by dust and silence, Calla realized this wasn't about conquering fear, it was about surrendering to trust. The kind of trust that could remake them both, if only they were brave enough to hold on. Somewhere deep in the barren land between them, a bridge was starting to build, plank by trembling plank. The wind whistled through the empty pasture as the sun began its slow descent, painting the fields in shades of bruised purple and deep gold. Calla stood at the fence, arms draped over the rough wood, watching Ashfall pace the length of the paddock. His movements were tight, agitated, his copper coat flashing with each restless stride. The fragile progress they had made in the round pen earlier seemed to dissolve with the coming night. Doubt gnawed at Calla's gut like a hungry wolf. Maybe this was more than she could fix with patience and hope. She rubbed the heel of her palm against her forehead, feeling the coarse scar tissue under her skin, a constant reminder of battles fought and lost. Was this any different? A war fought on different soil, with no weapons but trust and time? Ashfall tossed his head and kicked at the dirt, sending a plume of dust into the cooling air. The old fear crept in, cold and familiar. The fear that no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. That some things, some souls, were just too broken to heal. Inside the small barn, she filled a battered feed bucket, the metallic scrape echoing in the hollow space. She moved stiffly, every muscle aching with fatigue. Calla knew she should rest, but rest had always felt like surrender. Instead, she walked back toward the paddock, bucket in hand, her boots crunching over dry earth. Ashfall watched her approach, ears pinned flat against his head. She stopped a few feet away, crouching low, setting the bucket down without making eye contact, a small offering, without demand or expectation. Minutes dragged by in heavy silence. Calla stayed perfectly still, every instinct in her screaming to move, to act, to fix. But healing wasn't a mission you could conquer. Slowly, painfully, Ashfall crept forward, inch by inch. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of sweet grain. Still, he hesitated, eyes wary and mistrustful. Calla's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She willed herself not to reach out, not to push. She had to let him come to her on his terms, or not at all. When Ashfall finally dipped his head to sniff the feed, Calla bit the inside of her cheek to keep from gasping in relief. It was a small thing, infinitesimal in the grand scheme of their journey. But for Calla, it felt like standing at the edge of a battlefield and watching the first white flag wave across enemy lines. She stayed crouched, muscles burning from holding the position, as Ashfall tentatively took a mouthful. The faint crunch of grain between his teeth was the sweetest sound she had heard in months. And then, just as she thought the moment had settled, a loud crack echoed from the dark woods beyond the pasture. A sharp, splintering noise that sent Ashfall rearing into the air, eyes wide with terror. The bucket clattered to the ground. Calla stumbled to her feet, heart racing. Somewhere in the looming trees, something moved, and a new kind of fear gripped her tighter than any battlefield ever had. Calla froze, every muscle coiled tight as a wire. Her eyes strained against the gathering darkness, searching the tree-line for the source of the noise. Ashfall backed away, hooves slicing deep gouges into the dirt, snorting loud and frantic. Somewhere out there, hidden by the whispering trees, something, or someone, was watching. The air shifted, thick with unseen tension. Calla reached instinctively for a sidearm she no longer carried, a habit etched into her bones from too many years spent living between heartbeats. She forced herself to breathe, slow and measured. "Easy, boy," she murmured, voice low and steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Ashfall tossed his head again, but this time he didn't bolt. His fear was palpable, but so was his trust, tenuous, trembling, but real. She stepped between him and the woods, squaring her shoulders against the night. Whoever was out there, whatever had stirred the darkness, Calla would face it. She had made a promise the day she bought Ashfall. She would protect him, no matter what. Minutes dragged by, each second stretching thin and taut. The woods remained silent, save for the restless rustle of wind through brittle branches. Slowly, Ashfall lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he drew in the scents around him. Calla kept one eye on the trees and one hand lightly against his shoulder, anchoring them both. She felt it then, a subtle shift in the air, a retreat of unseen eyes. Whoever was out there had moved on, for now. But the sense of being hunted, of being unwelcome, lingered like smoke in the fading twilight. Still shaken, Calla led Ashfall back toward the barn, whispering quiet reassurances with every step. The paddock gate creaked as she latched it behind them. Inside the barn, the familiar smells of hay and leather were a small comfort against the chill sinking deeper into her bones. Ashfall moved restlessly in his stall, ears flicking at every small sound. Calla leaned against the stall door, closing her eyes for a moment, exhaustion pulling at her like an undertow. Dustwood wasn't just unfriendly, it was hostile. She had known that from the start, but tonight's encounter made it real in a way she hadn't wanted to face. As she prepared a small ration of hay, her mind wandered back to the sharp crack in the woods. It hadn't sounded like a branch snapping naturally. It was too deliberate, too loud. A rifle? A deliberate threat? Memories of distant deserts flashed behind her eyelids, ambushes hidden by rocks and silence. She swallowed hard, pushing the fear down where it couldn't paralyze her. She wasn't on a battlefield anymore. She had to believe that. But just as she was about to turn out the barn light, a figure appeared at the edge of the paddock, a silhouette half swallowed by shadow, watching her in the dark. Calla's blood ran cold. The figure remained still, a dark blot against the dim glow of the horizon. Calla's breath caught in her throat, every instinct screaming danger. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Only the low rattle of the barn door in the wind and Ashfall's restless shifting filled the heavy silence. Calla gripped the handle of the nearest stall door, mind racing. Confronting a threat alone in the middle of nowhere wasn't smart, but neither was showing fear. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped forward into the cold night air. "Can I help you?" she called, voice sharper than she intended. It cut through the darkness like a blade. The figure hesitated, then stepped closer into the spill of light from the barn. It was a man, older than she expected, face weathered and drawn, a battered hat pulled low over his eyes. He lifted his hands slowly, palms out in a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, voice rough like gravel. "Name's Eli. I just figured you oughta know you're stirring up a hornet's nest out here." Calla didn't lower her guard. "What are you talking about?" she asked, keeping her body between Ashfall's stall and the stranger. Eli glanced toward the barn, then back at her, his mouth tightening. "Ashfall," he said simply. "You buying him, stepping into Dustwood like you did. You made enemies, soldier girl. The kind that don't forget, and sure as hell don't forgive." His words weren't threatening, but they carried the weight of hard-earned truth. Calla's stomach twisted into knots. She had expected resentment, not open hostility. Ashfall neighed sharply from his stall, as if sensing the tension. Calla fought the urge to look back at him, keeping her focus locked on Eli. "Why tell me?" she asked. Trust didn't come easy anymore, and Dustwood wasn't the kind of place where strangers handed out warnings without a price. Eli shifted uncomfortably, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. "Because once, a long time ago, someone tried to warn me," he said, voice low. "And I didn't listen. Cost me more than I was willing to lose." For a heartbeat, the anger and distrust inside Calla wavered. She saw the grief etched into Eli's lined face, the ghosts that clung to him like a second skin. It wasn't pity he offered, it was experience, bitter and raw. She nodded once, slow and deliberate, accepting the truth even if she didn't like it. "Thanks," she muttered, the word tasting strange in her mouth. Eli tipped his hat, already backing away into the shadows. As he disappeared into the darkness, Calla stood alone under the heavy sky, the barn lights flickering against the rising wind. In her gut, she knew Eli's warning wasn't just kindness, it was a countdown. Somewhere out there, in the endless night, someone was already planning their next move. Sleep didn't come that night. Calla sat at the small kitchen table, a loaded cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every gust of wind outside, made her muscles tense. She replayed Eli's warning over and over in her mind, each repetition grinding deeper into her already fraying nerves. She had known from the start that winning Ashfall wouldn't make her welcome in Dustwood, but she hadn't expected to become a target. Now, the stakes were higher than ever. Outside the window, Ashfall shifted restlessly in his paddock, his copper coat gleaming under the pale moonlight. He was unsettled, sensing her tension, or maybe his own instinct warned him of the gathering storm. Calla watched him, feeling the thin thread of connection between them stretch taut. She couldn't run. Not again. This was her home now, whether Dustwood liked it or not. And she would fight for it, for him, with everything she had left inside. At first light, she went outside. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the metallic tang of coming rain. She saddled Ashfall carefully, every movement deliberate, every buckle checked twice. Trust wasn't built in safety. It was built when everything inside you screamed to retreat, and you chose to stay. Ashfall tossed his head once but stilled under her hand, his eyes bright, alive. Together, they rode beyond the paddock, into the wide, open fields that stretched toward the mountains. It wasn't just training. It was a statement. She wasn't hiding. As the morning wore on, clouds gathered low and heavy, turning the sky the color of worn steel. Calla guided Ashfall along the boundary fences, eyes sharp for any sign of tampering. She found it near the north line, fresh boot prints in the soft earth, a coil of barbed wire cut and left hanging loose. A clear message, plain as any written threat. Rage flared hot in her chest, followed by a cold, biting fear. They weren't just trying to intimidate her. They were waiting for her to break. Ashfall snorted uneasily, dancing sideways. Calla steadied him with a firm hand, whispering calming words she barely believed herself. She turned them back toward the house, scanning the hills, the tree lines, every shadow. She knew better than to expect a fair fight. Dustwood had its own rules, and breaking them came with a price. She would have to be ready. Not just for herself, but for Ashfall too. As they reached the crest of the hill overlooking the farmhouse, Calla saw something that made her heart plummet. Smoke, black, thick, and rising fast from the direction of her barn. The smell hit her first, the acrid, choking stench of burning wood and scorched earth. Calla urged Ashfall forward, heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. As they galloped down the hill, she could see it clearly. The barn was fully engulfed, flames licking high into the gray morning sky. Her hands tightened on the reins, fury and helplessness knotting inside her chest. She had survived battlefields halfway across the world, only to find herself fighting for her life all over again. Here, in the place she had tried to call home. She reached the gate and slid off Ashfall's back in one fluid motion. "Stay!" she commanded, voice cracking. The horse danced nervously but obeyed, nostrils flaring with the smoke. Calla ran toward the barn, shielding her face from the searing heat. It was already too late to save the building, but she had to make sure, had to know if there were any trapped animals, any chance to salvage something. The answer came in the form of the collapsing roof, a deafening roar as beams gave way and sent sparks showering into the air. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the smoke, but their faces told Calla everything. None would lift a hand to help. Dustwood had made its decision. They would rather see her burn with her dreams than see her succeed. Eli appeared through the haze, his weathered face grim. Without a word, he handed her a wet cloth to cover her mouth and nose, then turned to help control the fire's spread. In that moment, Calla realized something profound. Not everyone in Dustwood was against her. Some just needed a reason to believe in something better. Hours later, the fire was finally out. Only blackened skeletons remained where the barn had stood. Ashfall stood nearby, unharmed but rattled, his wide eyes searching for Calla. She crossed the scorched ground to him, running her soot-streaked hands along his neck, whispering promises only he could hear. They had lost much, but they were still standing. Together. And sometimes that was victory enough. As the sun began to set behind the smoke-streaked hills, Calla led Ashfall back toward the battered remains of the farm. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Rebuilding, earning trust, carving out a place where none had been offered. Dustwood could burn her buildings, tear down her walls, but it could not break her spirit. She and Ashfall had been chosen by each other, and no fire, no hatred, would ever take that away.